Quote, in summary, the present RCT study shows that the use of computational thinking via programming as a vehicle for learning mathematics in grades 4 and 5 is not as efficient as regular lessons where math is taught for itself. The transfer of learning, although critical, is difficult to achieve, even when the presumed best conditions are met to facilitate it by relying on a near, mathematics in both situations, and high road transfer, optimized by an explicit guidance of the teacher. Thus, visual programming languages should be introduced with caution if they are intended to replace regular mathematics teaching. The presented results are a strong indicator that this might be deleterious to mathematics acquisition, end quote. That's from page 8 of the publication titled Impact of Programming on Primary Mathematics Learning, which was written by Laurent, Rosemaria Crisci, Pascal Bressoux, Hamid Chaachoua, Cecily Nurra, Erica de Vries, and Pierre Tchounikine. I most likely butchered all those names, so my apologies for that. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, the aim of the study is to investigate whether a programming activity might serve as a learning vehicle for mathematics acquisition in grades 4 and 5. For this purpose, the effects of a programming activity, an essential component of computational thinking, were evaluated on learning outcomes of 3 mathematical notions: Euclidean division, n equals 1,880, additive decomposition, n equals 1,763, and fractions, n equals 644. Classes were randomly assigned to the programming, with Scratch, and control conditions. Multilevel analyses indicate negative effects, effect size range negative 0.16 to negative 0.21 of the programming condition for the 3 mathematical notions. A potential explanation of these results is the difficulties in the transfer of learning from programming to mathematics, end quote. If I were to summarize this study into a single sentence, I'd say that this randomized control study compared the impacts of learning mathematics with an integrated CS and mathematics course. And you can find a link to this paper in the show notes, which is linked in the description of whatever app you're listening to this on, or you can visit jaredoleary.com, where you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including well over 180 other podcast episodes at the date of this recording, which has solo episodes like this one, as well as many interviews with some awesome folks in computer science education and outside of the field talking about education in general. And if you don't know who I am, my CV is linked on my website, but I've worked with every grade kindergarten through doctoral students in a variety of contexts, from music education to computer science education. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know that I've had a very strong interest in exploring integration. Having previously developed professional development used by hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers around the country, as well as writing curriculum that's been used by a few 100,000 students around the world, I'm well aware that many people are very interested in the idea of integration. However, as I've mentioned in many of the episodes on integration, it's not really clear what people mean by it. Kind of like how computational thinking is a very vague term, where like if you say it to one person, they might have a different understanding than a different person. Same thing with integrating. There are many ways that you can integrate. I've mentioned this on many episodes, but I personally don't think the approach of just kind of like inserting or crowbarring computer science computational thinking into the classroom, like a math class or a science class or ELA or whatever, is going to improve both that subject area and computer science or computational thinking. If anything, I think it might lead to overwhelm. But there's not a lot of studies that actually look at how the two kind of work together or don't in those kind of contexts. So this study kind of actually explores that in terms of what does it look like if we take computer science concepts and teach mathematics with it in comparison to a class that is only focusing on math without computational thinking or computer science. Now, the authors in the introduction mention that there's not really any kind of conclusion on whether or not mathematics and CS integration has a positive, negative, or neutral effect. If it were positive, great. Then we can see that, hey, if you incorporate these two or integrate these two different subject areas, you'll have a better result than if you do not do that. And that better is kind of like dependent on what you're looking at. Maybe it's more motivation or higher test scores or whatever. There's many factors in there. But another good result could be, hey, it has no negative impact. It has a neutral impact on there. Even though you might be taking away some time from the subject area, by incorporating another domain, you're learning two things without at the cost of the first one. But we also don't really have enough research to find out whether or not it actually has a negative impact, which is what I would guess might happen depending on how things are integrated. Now, the authors note in their introduction that of the studies that do look at integration, it's usually looking at it from a computer science standpoint to see like, hey, if we integrate computer science into ELA classes, what kind of computer science concepts and practices can you learn in those settings? Not necessarily what kind of an impact does it have have on ELA. When it does look at that kind of impact, it doesn't necessarily do it in a randomized control study, which is admittedly difficult to get without lots of funding like NSF grants, things like that. Now, when it comes to computational thinking, many people talk about how, well, this like pattern recognition and abstraction and etc. is all going to be helpful for understanding X, Y, or Z subject areas. And while that might sound fancy, those claims aren't always backed by empirical research. It's like for music educators, like there was this like music makes you smarter campaign that was going on. I believe that was the wording that was going on like a decade or two ago. And that was actually based off of faulty research, like the whole so-called Mozart effect. Basically, any stimulant is going to make it so that you're going to perform better on a test, whether you do jumping jacks or listen to Mozart. And it's only going to have an effect size depending on how you listen to it and for a short period afterwards. And the same can be said with some of the studies on computational thinking. Or not necessarily studies, but some of the research. It might be a hypothesis that, hey, this skill of abstraction is useful. It would probably be useful in this other setting. That would be called transfer or the transfer effect. And we don't really have a lot of studies that look to see, does this impact understanding of abstraction and does it actually transfer over into another domain? A lot of the studies that do look at transfer find that the skills do not necessarily transfer over, or the understandings don't transfer over. And this is just from like integration studies in general and like different transfer effects and things that I've looked at in like sports psychology and educational psychology, etc. Everything that I was just saying, you can find a study or two that is going to say, actually, Jared, this says the other way. And that's great. But it all comes down to, we don't really have a conclusion on this yet. We're still kind of figuring things out. I happen to be in the camp where I'm very skeptical about it, not only from a learning standpoint, but also from like a power structure standpoint and whatnot in terms of like, are we putting domains in subservient relationships to other domains? And I've talked about that in other episodes that I link in the show notes. But I keep bringing up these integration studies because, again, I think it's important for us to explore these. Now, here's a quote from page 3 that is kind of like a little bow on what I was just kind of saying. Quote, "Moreover, results on the effects of programming to learn mathematics should be viewed with caution because among the majority of studies interested in the effects of the use of programming through mathematics, lots are targeting the effects of computational thinking skills and not on mathematical learning. Among the few that are targeting mathematical learning, few are randomized controlled trials based on empirical measures of learning outcomes in mathematics." End quote. Okay, so why is it so important to have randomized controlled trials? Well, you might have a study where you're looking at case studies, multiple case studies, doing some qualitative research, or even like looking in a specific district or class or school or whatever. Those are great. I love those studies in terms of being able to understand perspectives and whatnot, and to understand how does this very specific population respond to a treatment or whatever. But a randomized control study makes it so you can actually make some generalizable statements to say, using the statistics that we've went through, we found that this would likely have an effect outside of this population for X, Y, and Z characteristics or situations, contexts, etc. So if we had more randomized control studies, and specifically more longitudinal randomized control studies in education, not just like something that happens in like a 6-week period or something like that, but maybe a 6-year period, then we can actually start to look at cause and effect in education. And that's something that we talked about with like many other people like Andreas Stefik in our interview, which is all the way in episode 27, which is titled Accessible CS Education Through Evidence-Based Programming Languages with Andreas Stefik. So I highly recommend checking out that one as well as all the other interviews because there's some awesome guests on this podcast. Okay, so now we've kind of talked about the introduction, like a broader overview of things. So let's take a look at, well, what was actually happening in this particular study. So in this study, they looked at 3 different mathematical concepts. So these were Euclidean division, additive decomposition, and fractions. Each of these had a pre-test and a post-test that were administered by teachers to an entire class. In total, there were 107 classes from 46 different schools, and each one of the schools was assigned to a treatment and control group. The treatment group would receive mathematics instruction integrated with computer science, whereas the control group would only do mathematics, like by writing out algebraic equations, etc. And this was with grades 4 and 5, so this is like ages 9 through 11, with a total of 2,472 students. Now, there's a lot of really interesting tables and a lot of interesting details that are kind of explored in terms of like what are the means and standard deviations between the treatment and controls, etc. I highly recommend taking a look at that. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because I don't think it'd be very interesting in an audio podcast. I'm going to read for you a quote on the bottom of page 6. Quote, "The effect of the programming group is systematically significant and negative for all final models. Belonging to the programming group leads to a significant decrease in final performance for each concepts in comparison to the control group. This decrease is 0.16 standard deviations for Euclidean division, 0.19 standard deviations for additive decomposition, and 0.21 standard deviations for fractions, all other things being equals. It explains 10% of the between-class variance of the final score for Euclidean division, 6.3% of the same variance for additive decomposition, and 17% of this same variance for fractions. End quote. Again, this is from page 6. So in other words, the group that was doing math and CS performed worse than the group that just did math. Now, in page 7, in the discussion section, the authors have 3 potential explanations for this. So let's explore each one of those. All right, so the first reason that they may have scored lower is because teachers are spending more time teaching Scratch or teaching students how to use Scratch than they were actually teaching mathematics. So a question that might be explored is, over time, like an extended period of time, several years, let's see what happens in these treatment and control groups. Does the mathematics group only perform better than the mathematics integrated with computer science or computer science integrated with mathematics? What about some of the other approaches that we talked about in other integration episodes where they're going in parallel? So we have mathematics teaching a concept, which is then reinforced by a computer science class, which teaches the similar concept from a different perspective or different angle. Which approach to integration work better or worse? Again, we need longitudinal studies to figure out, okay, how does this actually have an impact down the road? But this is an important thing to consider. Maybe if this was a longer study and it was lasting for like at least a year, the teachers had more experience with it or students had more experience with Scratch, maybe they would have spent more time on mathematics in the class and maybe they would have scored just as well as the class that only did mathematics. Or maybe they would have been more motivated to want to continue to learn mathematics. Like that in and of itself, even if it had a lower score, I would argue is going to make it so that students would want to stick with it longer, have more grit, and actually enjoy the subject area in the long run. As opposed to someone like myself who scored well on math classes, but I never pursued it beyond any of the requirements that I was mandated to take. Maybe if I had an integrated computer science and math class, maybe I would have found a passion in it. Another explanation is the amount of time that was on task. So having worked with Scratch with a variety of students, from second grade all the way up through like college students, there can be a lot of off-task time, if we might think of it that way, where you are just exploring the different features and functions, like, well, what happens if I reverse the sound effect? Or what happens if I change the different costumes? As opposed to like focusing on mathematics and computer science integration, you're focusing on all the little neat things that you can do in Scratch, which is great. It gets people interested in the platform, wanting to learn things. Maybe they'll create more stuff at home, express themselves, blah, 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 blah. Huge fan of that. But if we're just trying to figure out whether or not an integration with Scratch and math is going to have any kind of an effect, positive, negative, or neutral, the amount of time that students spent like exploring those different features would have potentially taken away time from them actually exploring the mathematics, concepts, skills, understandings, or whatever. So that's a good second potential explanation for this. The third potential explanation that the authors mention, it has to do with like memory management. So cognitive load theory, which is an idea that you can hold, I believe, 7 plus or minus 2 things at any given moment. So like if I ask you to memorize a phone number, you might be able to do that, hold on to that in your memory. But if I ask you to do that while walking on a tightrope, while reciting the alphabet backwards, and like doing that while, I don't know, scratching your head while patting your tummy, the odds of you being able to remember that phone number significantly decrease the more cognitive load that you have, which is why the theory, I believe, was 7 plus or minus 2 things. It depends on like how complicated it is or whatever the task is, etc. You can maybe do 5 and hold on to it, or maybe do 9, but usually it's around 7. So going back to what the authors were positing here is maybe with cognitive load theory, the idea of holding and learning a new mathematics concept while holding and learning a new computer science platform, maybe combining those two is too much cognitive load on a student, which is one of the things that we've talked about in many of the other integration episodes that I've done, is that if you're going to teach students 2 new things simultaneously, they're going to have to try and split their attention on something rather than teaching one either before you learn the other or in parallel with but disconnected. So for example, one of the things I've talked about quite frequently is if you're going to teach music and computer science, it can be very difficult to learn music concepts, skills, practices, etc. while learning computer science one at the same time. Ask me how I know. I've got a drum set right behind me, have a PhD in music education, and I've taught computer science education for almost a decade. I'm very grateful I learned one before the other because I was able to apply my understanding with better ease than some of the students that I've seen try and do both simultaneously. It certainly can be done, but it can be a little more frustrating, which I've seen some research on that talks about how this can be very difficult for students when they are asked to learn 2 things simultaneously, and it can lead to burnout or frustration faster than if they learn each of them sequentially or in parallel with each other rather than simultaneously. But again, other episodes kind of explore different approaches where you're learning stuff in parallel rather than simultaneously. And that's kind of a very quick summary and introduction to the paper itself. I do recommend taking a look at it. It's very interesting, and I do appreciate the 3 the explanations that they provided at the end. But at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to talk about some of my lingering questions and thoughts. So one of them is, what approaches to integration do you think work better than others? We've talked about integration quite a bit and different approaches that you can take when you're integrating CS with another subject area, etc. But which of those approaches do you think would work better than others, and why? And if you're working with somebody who wanted to integrate CS with another subject area, what advice would you give them? Would you warn them, or would you encourage them? Why would you do one over the other, and when would you do one over the other? For example, if the teacher is an expert in both computer science and another domain that they are teaching, would you encourage them to integrate the two? If the teacher was novice to both computer science and another domain that they were being forced to integrate with, would you encourage them to do that? Or would you talk to admin and go, I don't know if we should be doing that in that way? It might actually turn students away from both domains, because maybe it's going to be taught in a way that would be discouraging or frustrating for students. I pose these questions, and I've certainly shared my own opinions on these in the different podcast episodes, but there's not a right or wrong way to do this. With education, everything is gray. There are many different contexts and different nuances that would inform one district's or teacher's decision to do something different than another. I just think it's important for us to think through these things and kind of share our discussions on it. I also think it's important that we have more research studies like this that are actually looking at randomized control studies, but also looking at it from a longitudinal standpoint, like several years ideally. Unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of those, at least not in the field of computer science education. Like in the NSF grants that I've worked on in terms of applications and stuff, they often ask you to use the What Works Clearinghouse, which usually has a bunch of longitudinal studies talking about here's the effects of this type of professional development on blah blah blah. Great. But it's all on subject areas other than computer science. So we often have to look at it and say, well, it worked this way in this other subject area, so we think it would work this way in computer science, professional development, or curriculum, or whatever. And so it's just kind of a big guess. We need more of this kind of research. I enjoy studies like these, and if you did too, and you know somebody who might enjoy this as well, please consider sharing this episode with them. It just helps more people find the free resources on my website, jaredoleary.com. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're staying safe and are having a wonderful week.